Somewhere on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, a storage tank is on fire. Not a small fire, not a building fire, the kind you see on the evening news with a single ladder truck and a crowd of neighbors watching from behind police tape. This is an industrial fire, the kind that eats a structure the size of a football stadium, that produces a pillar of black smoke visible from space, that requires almost 100 emergency personnel and more than 30 pieces of heavy equipment just to keep it from spreading. The kind of fire that, when you stand close enough, you don't just see, you feel it, a wall of heat pressing against your face like something that is alive and angry. The kind of fire that takes days, sometimes, to fully die. The facility on fire is called Tamanneftegaz. It sits in Krasnodar Krai on the Taman Peninsula at the narrow strait where the Black Sea and the Azov Sea meet. If you look at a map, you'll understand immediately why this place matters. It is almost touching the Crimean Bridge. It is almost touching occupied Crimea. It is, in every logistical sense, the last major choke point before Russia's shadow economy of petroleum meets the water that carries it to the rest of the world. So, again, the question is not really who did it. The question, the one that keeps me awake when I think about this conflict, is what it means that they were able to do it at all, and what it means that this is now the 6th time they've done exactly this to exactly this facility. Today is June 14th, 2026, and in the last 24 hours, the tempo of this war, the one underneath the war, the financial one, the logistical one, has tightened in ways that deserve your full attention. This is Prof. Jane. If you're new here, this channel is about the economics, the supply chains, and the financial architecture of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the war underneath the war. If that's the kind of analysis you're looking for, consider subscribing. We don't chase headlines, we follow the money. Let's start with what actually happened. On the night of June 12th into the 13th, Ukraine's Security Service, the SBU, specifically its Alpha Special Operations Center, working in coordination with the Special Operations Forces and military intelligence, carried out what can only be described as a 2-node simultaneous strike on Russia's oil infrastructure. The first node was Tamanneftegaz itself. Drones hit 5 fuel storage tanks, 2 oil loading racks, a truck freight parking area, warehouses, and critically, Russian air defense positions protecting the terminal. The second node, struck the same night, was an oil preparation and pumping workshop near the settlement of Kotovo in Volgograd Oblast, specifically a facility that collects and prepares crude oil from the Korobkovskoye oil and gas field and neighboring deposits across Volgograd, Astrakhan, and the Republic of Kalmykia. Its name, confirmed by independent monitoring channels, is the Yefimovka oil pumping station. 2 nodes, 1 night. Production and export hit simultaneously. The governor of Krasnodar Krai, Veniamin Kondratiev, acknowledged the fire. He said 96 people and over 30 pieces of equipment were working to contain the blaze. He attributed the fire, and here you need to hold this thought, to falling drone debris, not direct hits, debris. This is a framing you will see again and again from Russian regional officials, and it is worth filing away because it tells you something about how the Russian state chooses to present infrastructure damage to its own population. The official Ukrainian account is different. The SBU stated publicly that their forces struck 5 tanks and 2 loading racks directly. Neither account can be fully independently verified as of this recording. The fire, however, is real. The smoke is real. The 96 emergency workers are real. Now here's where I need you to stay with me, because the truly significant thing about the June 13th strike is not the fire itself. It is the pattern that the fire represents. Tamanneftegaz has now been struck at least 6 times since December 2025. December 21st and 22nd, drones damaged a pipeline, 2 piers and 2 vessels. The fire covered more than 1,000 square meters and took Russian emergency services over a day to extinguish. December 31st struck again as part of a New Year's Eve package that also targeted the Tuapse oil refinery and ammunition depots. January 21st and 22nd, 4 petroleum product storage tanks caught fire. February 15th, another series of explosions, another confirmed tank fire. May 13th strike, drones hit the marine terminal's infrastructure. A tanker was reportedly alongside the berth in the process of loading when the drones arrived. And now, June 13th, 6 strikes, 1 terminal, 6 months. Let me give you the scale of what this terminal is. Tamanneftegaz has a design throughput capacity of approximately 19.9 million tons of oil and petroleum products per year. Its tank farm storage capacity exceeds 1 million cubic meters. It handles petroleum products arriving by rail to sea transport, meaning it is a transshipment hub, the place where products that travel by train meet the tankers that carry them to global markets. It handles LPG, petroleum, oil, and it also handles grain, coal, and fertilizer. But most importantly, it handles fuel. And it sits within direct logistical proximity to the Crimean Bridge and to occupied Crimea, meaning its disruption is not just an economic event, it cascades into the supply chains sustaining Russian military operations in the south. To understand the full weight of what has happened, you need to follow the cause and effect chain upstream from Taman, not just downstream toward the sea. Start at Volgograd. The Lukoil Volgograd refinery is or was the largest producer of petroleum products in Russia's southern federal district. Its capacity is 14.8 million tons of petroleum products per year, and it accounts for approximately 5% of Russia's total national refining throughput. It is, in short, not a marginal facility. It is the hub that sits between Russia's oil fields and Russia's front lines. On May 29th, Ukrainian strikes halted the number one primary oil distillation unit, which alone accounts for about 40% of the plant's production capacity, along with units 5 and 6. The plant halted production entirely. As of this recording, Lukoil has not indicated a restart timeline. Repair estimates range from weeks to months depending on which units sustain structural damage versus fire damage. Now follow the June 13th strike at Kodovo. The Yefimovka pumping station sits upstream of the Volgograd refinery. It collects and prepares crude from the Korobkovskoye field and neighboring deposits. So think about what the June 13th two-node strike actually achieved in strategic terms. Ukraine hit the upstream crude preparation facility, feeding into a refinery that is already offline, and simultaneously hit the downstream export terminal where finished products would have been shipped to sea. In a single operational window, Ukraine compressed both ends of the processing chain at the same time. The export data confirms this pressure is real, not theoretical. Following drone strikes in mid-May, oil product exports at Taman fell 53% month-on-month. 53%. That is not a disruption. That is a near collapse of throughput at one of Russia's most important Black Sea export hubs. And Taman is not the only Black Sea terminal bleeding. The Rosneft-owned Tuops refinery, Russia's fifth largest oil product export installation, has also been struck repeatedly. Monthly loadings of Russian oil products at Tuops were 91% lower in May 2026 than in May 2025. 91%. Year-on-year, loadings through Tuops fell 65% between January and April. Between Taman and Tuops, you are looking at the near total suppression of Black Sea petroleum export capacity. This matters for a reason that goes beyond Ukraine. Russia's ability to export petroleum products through the Black Sea is not just how it earns hard currency. It is how it supplies military logistics across the Black Sea region. The Institute for the Study of War assessed as recently as June 7th that gasoline shortages in occupied Crimea are worsening due to long and intermediate range strikes, and that occupied Crimea is starting to experience shortages of basic goods and supplies beyond gasoline. When a strategic export hub and a military logistics corridor are the same place, disrupting one disrupts both. Now extend the picture to the rest of Russia's export infrastructure. Ukraine strikes have reduced Russia's average refinery capacity to 4.69 million barrels per day, the lowest level since December 2009. Think about that for a moment. Ukraine is pushing Russian refining capacity back to levels not seen in 17 years. In January and February of this year alone, Ukrainian forces carried out more than 40 strikes on oil and gas infrastructure inside Russia, hitting 13 refineries, oil depots, and other facilities. Strikes on Baltic terminals in late March reportedly cost Russia nearly $1 billion in potential revenue in that period alone. The SBU's own public statement from June 13th is worth quoting directly, because it captures the explicit strategic logic. The Russian oil and gas industry, they wrote, is a source of funding for the war against Ukraine. These petrodollars, they said, are being turned into missiles, drones, and ammunition. That is why, they stated, the SSU will continue to systematically deprive Russia's war machine of resources needed to wage war. Systematic. That word is doing a lot of work in that sentence. This is not opportunistic strike and move. This is an architecture. And the architecture is beginning to show up in Russia's fiscal numbers. Russia's oil and gas revenues are projected at approximately 8.65 trillion rubles, roughly $105 billion for 2025. That is 22% lower than the 11.13 trillion rubles collected in 2024. Russia's 2026 budget is built on a structural deficit of 4.6 trillion rubles, about $54.8 billion, representing 1.6% of GDP, with total spending of 44.9 trillion rubles against revenue of 40.3 trillion rubles. And Russia has now cut its 2026 GDP growth forecast to just 0.4%, down from a prior projection of 1.3%. Here is where this connects to you, sitting somewhere far from the Black Sea. Every barrel of Russian petroleum that does not make it to market is a barrel that does not suppress global oil prices from the supply side. Every dollar that Russia does not earn from energy exports is a dollar it cannot spend on artillery shells, on drone components, on soldiers' wages. And every month that Russia runs a larger deficit is a month where the Kremlin faces harder choices: cut military spending, cut civilian welfare spending, raise taxes, or borrow more. Russia has already raised its VAT rate. It is already borrowing heavily. The fiscal math is tightening. You may not live near the Black Sea, but if you've filled a gas tank in the last 2 years, if you've paid a utility bill, if you've noticed that global commodity prices remain stubbornly elevated, you are already living inside the economic perimeter of this war. That is not metaphor. That is supply chain reality. Now, I want to be honest about what I don't know, because I think that honesty is what separates analysis from propaganda. I do not know the full extent of the physical damage from the June 13th strike at Taman. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed fires, confirmed the operational targets, and stated that the extent of the damage is being assessed. No independent satellite imagery verifying the specific number of tanks destroyed versus merely burning has been published as of this recording. 5 tanks burning and 5 tanks destroyed are very different outcomes. I do not yet know which we are dealing with. I also want to be honest about something that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace raised in April, because they are right, and ignoring it would make me exactly the kind of analyst I don't want to be. Their researchers noted that the most badly damaged terminal at Ust-Luga in the Baltic had resumed loading by April 7th, and over the following 2 weeks managed to send out roughly half of its pre-strike volumes. Their conclusion? The oil not exported due to Ukrainian strikes is not necessarily lost, it may simply be sold at a later date. Russia has approximately 20 million tons of total storage capacity through Transneft. That buffer is real. When you disrupt export terminals, crude accumulates in that network and eventually Russia can draw it back down. Anyone selling you certainty about the permanent, irreversible crippling of Russian oil exports is lying to you. The evidence does not show that. What it shows is a sustained, accumulating campaign of disruption that is progressively more difficult for Russia to compensate for with each passing month. There is also this. During the peak of Ukrainian strike activity in August through October of 2025, Russian oil production fell by approximately 6% relative to the prior year, around 300,000 barrels per day. That is real. But it is also far less than the roughly 20% of capacity that was offline at peak, which tells you that Russia has been able to reroute processing to spare capacity elsewhere. Russia is resilient. It has been managing Western sanctions for 4 years. It has shadow fleets, alternative ports, willing buyers in Asia. Do not underestimate its ability to adapt. And here is a third thing I want to acknowledge plainly. Oil and gas revenues, while significant, now account for just over 22% of Russia's federal budget. The new Eurasian Strategy Center has concluded that even significantly harsher energy pressure would be unlikely to fully undermine the Kremlin's ability to finance the war because non-oil tax revenues and domestic borrowing have expanded to compensate. Russia is not one energy strike away from collapse. It may not be 10 strikes away. The relationship between infrastructure damage and strategic capitulation is long, uncertain, and nonlinear. Both things can be true at the same time. The campaign is hurting Russia, and Russia is not going to collapse tomorrow. Both can be true. What the evidence does show, and I think this is the genuinely important analytical conclusion, is that Ukraine has achieved something in 2026 that it could not consistently achieve before: simultaneous long-range reach against production nodes, refining nodes, and export nodes in the same operational window. The June 12-13 strikes hit a pumping station more than 500 kilometers from the front. They hit Taman, approximately 260 kilometers from the nearest active front line. They hit both in a single night. That is a capability evolution, not just a lucky strike. And Baker Institute analyst Gabriel Collins noted in March that if Ukraine increases strikes and begins to incorporate heavier weapons, which he described as a likely evolution in 2026, Russia's reconstitution potential will likely erode. The ISW noted on June 11th that Ukrainian forces appear to have achieved a tactical drone overmatch on the battlefield and are intensifying a middle-range strike campaign that is reportedly driving higher Russian casualties amidst declining recruitment rates. The energy campaign and the battlefield campaign are converging. That convergence is the story, so let me tell you what the evidence does show and what it does not. It shows that the Tamanneftegaz terminal, which handles nearly 20 million tons of petroleum products per year and supports both Russian commercial exports and Black Sea Fleet logistics, has been struck 6 times in 6 months and is on fire as of this recording. It shows that the Volgograd refinery, which accounts for 5% of Russia's total refining throughput, has been halted since May 29th, with no confirmed restart timeline. It shows that oil product exports at Taman fell 53% in May, and loadings at Twatsfell fell 91% year-on-year in the same month. It shows that Russia's overall refinery capacity has been pushed to its lowest point in 17 years. It shows that Russia's oil and gas revenues are projected 22% lower in 2025 than they were in 2024. That the 2026 budget carries a structural deficit of nearly $55 billion, and that the Kremlin has cut its own growth forecast to less than 0.5%. What the evidence does not show, not yet, is a Russian state approaching fiscal collapse, or an energy export network that cannot recover over time, or a linear relationship between infrastructure damage and strategic outcome. Russia is adapting. Its storage buffers are real. Its rerouting capacity is real. Its non-oil revenue base has grown. The campaign is a pressure campaign, not a killing blow. The fire at Taman is real and significant. The pattern behind the fire is more significant still. But patterns take time to become outcomes, and outcomes are not guaranteed. Here's the question I want to leave you with. We talk in the West about sanctions. We talk about arms deliveries, about diplomatic packages, about the price of Russian oil at various ceiling levels. We have built an entire architecture of pressure that is deliberately designed to be gradual, calibrated, and deniable. But Ukraine, with its drones, is now doing something different. It is building pressure that is concentrated, visible, and direct. A tank on fire at a specific terminal on a specific night is not gradual. It is not deniable. It is a coordinate on a map and a column of smoke in the sky. The question is not whether Ukraine can keep doing this. The evidence suggests it can and is getting better at it. The question is whether accumulated pressure on Russia's financial architecture, fiscal deficits, declining export revenues, crippled refineries, shortages in occupied Crimea eventually translates into strategic change in Moscow. And that question is one that no one, not analysts in Washington or Kyiv or London, can answer with confidence. History is not clear on the relationship between economic pain and political decision-making in authoritarian states. Sometimes pain changes behavior, sometimes it calcifies it. The fire at Taman is the latest data point. What Russia does with the pressure building beneath it is the open question, and it will remain open for longer than any of us would like. This is Profas Zhang. I'll see you in the next one. Let me slow down here and build this out, because the geography of this supply chain is important, and I want you to be able to visualize it. Russia's oil and petroleum products travel, broadly speaking, through 3 corridors to reach global markets: the Baltic in the northwest, the Black Sea in the south, and pipelines running east to China. The Baltic corridor, primarily the ports of Ust-Luga and Primorsk, handles a significant share of crude exports. The Black Sea corridor, Taman, Tuapse, Novorossiysk, handles a large share of refined petroleum products, including diesel, fuel oil, and naphtha. The Eastern corridor carries crude to Chinese buyers under long-term arrangements. Ukraine cannot easily reach the Eastern corridor. Its drones have to travel east through heavily defended territory to get anywhere near the pipeline infrastructure feeding China. But the Black Sea corridor, Taman, Tuapse, and the approaches to Novorossiysk is geometrically accessible from Ukrainian-held territory and from Ukrainian assets positioned in the Black Sea itself. And the Baltic corridor, while far from the front, has proven reachable through extended-range drone operations. Ukraine has been systematically working both accessible corridors simultaneously. The Transneft pipeline network, which moves crude from producing fields to refining and export facilities, has a total storage capacity of approximately 20 million tons. When export terminals are disrupted, crude backs up into that storage network. The system can absorb disruption for a while. But as more terminals are hit, as more refineries go offline, and as the export volumes at functioning terminals are forced to compensate, the back pressure builds. Storage fills up. Producers are eventually asked to curtail output. That is the mechanism by which infrastructure damage translates into production decline. Not immediately, not dramatically, but cumulatively. In August through October 2025, during what had been the peak of the Ukrainian strike campaign at that point, Russian oil production fell approximately 6%, around 300,000 barrels per day relative to the prior year. That was with roughly 20% of refining capacity offline at peak. The gap between capacity offline and production decline tells you how much rerouting Russia was able to do during that period. But each wave of strikes is harder to compensate for than the last because spare capacity gets used up, storage fills, and the network's flexibility is progressively exhausted. The June 2026 campaign appears designed to stress the system at both ends simultaneously: upstream crude preparation at Kotovo and downstream export loading at Taman. If both ends of the processing chain are compromised in the same window, the ability to compensate through rerouting is further constrained. I also want to acknowledge something that is easy to miss in coverage of this campaign, which tends to focus on the terminals and the refineries and the export numbers. There are civilians caught inside this story. The Russian workers at these facilities, the people who load the tankers, who maintain the pipelines, who monitor the storage tanks, are not soldiers. The June 13th strike killed 1 person and injured 3, according to Governor Kondratiev's figures, and those were likely facility personnel, not military targets. Ukraine's position is that these facilities directly fund the war machine and are therefore legitimate military objectives under international law. That argument has legal weight, but it does not make the human cost invisible. A 22-year-old technician at a petroleum terminal in Krasnodar Krai did not personally order the invasion of Ukraine. This is what war does. It distributes the cost of political decisions onto people who did not make them. I say this not to undermine Ukraine's strategic logic. I think that logic is coherent and the campaign is legally and militarily defensible. I say it because I believe you should be able to hold both things at once. That disrupting Russia's war financing is a legitimate and arguably necessary military objective, and that the people caught in those facilities are human beings. The tendency to flatten war into clean narratives of infrastructure and percentages is something I try to resist on this channel, even when the analytical work requires dealing in those numbers. There is also the question of Russian public perception. The Kremlin's media apparatus attributes every facility fire to falling drone debris, not to direct strikes. This framing is internally consistent with the state's narrative that Ukraine is a terrorist entity attacking civilian infrastructure, rather than a military force executing a coherent economic campaign. Whether Russian citizens believe this narrative is impossible to measure with precision, But the consistent use of it tells you that the Kremlin sees domestic perception management as a live vulnerability, that the visibility of infrastructure damage inside Russia is a problem they are actively trying to manage. That too is information.